Moving on to the next exercise, we are now going to learn how to do the processing of the JSON string in the background. Now, earlier we had the JSON string already included in the code. Now we are going to read the JSON string from a file, which obviously means that it's going to take longer time than getting direct access to the JSON string that is already in the code. This is going to consume time, so you cannot do it on the UI thread. So you need to find a way of doing this processing in the background. We're going to take the help of the AsyncTask, which is one of the constructs that is available in Android that makes it very straightforward to dispatch work to be done in the background. The AsyncTask provides you with several methods, some of which are executed on the main UI thread. So when you need to do any processing or updating things on the user interface, then you do that using those methods of the AsyncTask. Then there are other methods specifically called do in background. Now you obviously understand what do in background is going to do. This method is going to do all the work included in that method in a background thread automatically for you. So you don't need to worry about creating your own background threads and so on. Now, when you see the construction of the AsyncTask, it looks so straightforward to be used in many circumstances. In this case, we are going to use the do in background method in order to read in the JSON string from a file line by line, and then construct the JSON string, and then go ahead and process the JSON string and then convert it into a list of objects that then we can use to initialize the list view. Now, when you are doing background processing, you need a method of keeping the user informed about the fact that you are doing processing in the background. Now, typically progress indicators are used for this purpose. You could use some kind of a progress bar or a progress dialog for keeping the user informed about the fact that something is being processed in the background. Now we are going to use the progress dialog for this example to illustrate that point. Now, as you see the app running, you will understand how the progress dialog works in practice. Let's see the app running on the emulator. When the app starts running on the emulator, you can see that there is a progress dialog that is displayed for you there. Once the processing is done, then you see the information rendered onto the user interface, and the progress dialog is dismissed at that point. Now we're going to use the AsyncTask to do all this work for you. In addition, in this exercise, I'm going to make use of another library for doing image downloading in the background on our behalf. This is called as the Picasso library, which you will see me using for downloading and initializing the image view for each of those list items. Once again, as usual, download the zip file and import the project into Android Studio, and you will notice that I have pre-configured some parts of the application already for you. Let's visit each of those pieces step by step. Now, I haven't changed any of the layouts. They remain exactly the same as before. I have now included an async task in my contacts activity. So let's go and visit the contacts activity and then examine the code, the new code there. Now, in the contacts activity, you see that in the onCreate method, I am going to, at some point, ask the async task to start in the background, process the JSON string, and then come back and show me the result on the user interface. Coming down below, we will now see the async task. Now, this async task, obviously, I am creating a class here extending the async task here. And then I have implemented part of the async task and left part of it for us to construct as we go along. Now, you still see me using the process friend info method that I had implemented in the previous exercise. I'm going to use the exact same method for processing the JSON string using the JSON library. Now, let's see how we would start the async task. Going to the onCreate method, you see that we have a to-do statement there. I'm going to replace that with the appropriate code to show you how the async task is to be initialized and started. Coming back, we see that I have now substituted the to-do statement with a couple of statements here. Now, I am creating a new task of the async task type, which is the friends processor. That's the name I gave to the subclass that I just created. And then I am then calling this async task. And when you need to start the async task, you will specify the reference to the task and then call the execute method. And in here, you will supply the parameter that is going to be delivered to the async task. Now, when you call the execute, you are essentially issuing a call to the Android framework. At that point, the Android framework is going to take over and then call the methods that you implement in the async task in a particular order in order to get your work done. Now, going back to the async task down below, we will notice that in the async task, of course, I have a constructor method for the async task, which is very simple. I am not doing anything meaningful there. Then I have another method called as onPreExecute that I have already filled in here. Now, the onPreExecute method is the first method that the Android framework is going to call when it needs to begin your async task. The code inside the onPreExecute method is going to be executed on the main UI thread. So whatever code you include here is executed on the main UI thread, which means that you have access to the user interface and then you can modify things in the user interface. Now, in Android, you can never modify the user interface from any thread other than the main UI thread. So if you are doing work in the background thread cannot directly modify the user interface. So that's the reason why we have the onPreExecute. So before you start, you want to do something on the main user interface before you move on into the background processing stage. Now, in the onPreExecute method, I am starting a progress dialog. And so this is what you saw being shown on the screen. So the progress dialog is created using this statement here. Now, when I am finished with the background processing and then I come back, then I'm going to dismiss this progress dialog so that the user will have access to the UI. Now, as long as the progress dialog is being displayed on the screen, the user cannot interact with the UI of the contacts activity. So now you see that the contacts activity is in the on paused state at this point. You can still see it in the background, but you cannot directly interact with it. So this is one of those cases where Android framework will call the onPause method of the contacts activity and then put the dialog on top of that. Now, the doInBackground is the method that is going to be executed in the background. So once the onPreExecute method has been completed, then the Android framework is going to come back and call the doInBackground method. So when it calls the doInBackground method, it is going to pass in the parameter that you supplied to the execute call as one of the parameters, incoming parameters for this. So we gave the name of the file as a parameter, so that is going to be delivered as a string parameter here. So how do you get access to that? I'll show you that in a minute. Inside the doInBackground method, I am going to open an input stream and a buffered reader. Now, if you are familiar with Java input-output from files, this is how you're supposed to proceed. So you will create an input stream and a buffered reader. Now, after that, in order to simulate a network delay or background processing delay, I basically make the thread go to sleep for a short period of time. So this helps me to display the progress dialog on the screen. In real life, if you are accessing a distant server, it is going to take a certain amount of time for the JSON string to be downloaded from the server. So you don't really need to do this if you are really accessing a background server, because that is automatically going to delay the work for you. And so your progress dialog will be displayed on the screen. So after that, I will go into a try-catch set where I am going to read the file line by line and then convert it into a JSON string and then process the JSON string using my process info method that I had implemented earlier. So in there you can see that I have a to-do statement. So I need to substitute the to-do statement with code that will read in the information from a file and then construct the JSON string and then do the background processing. Okay, now that we are back, I have substituted the to-do statement with the appropriate code. Let's examine this code in a bit more detail. Now in here, I am opening a file. Now this file I have included in a folder called the assets folder in your project. Now this assets folder can include files that you can read in from your application code. So right there, I open an input stream to access the file. So notice that I am giving strings 0 as the parameter for this open method call. This string 0 essentially is the set of strings that got delivered as parameters for the do in background. In this case, since I passed only one string, which is the name of the file, I only have one single parameter coming in, and that is accessed by specifying it as strings 0. So strings is the name of the strings parameter array that came in. So anytime you have parameters coming into the do in background, it is delivered as an array of objects. In this case, it's an array of strings. So I supply that as a parameter. So I open the file, then I open a buffered reader and read in the file line by line. And then as I read line by line from the file, I append it to a character buffer or a string buffer. And once I have completed reading the entire file, then I will convert that string buffer into a string. And then after I convert that into a string, then I will call this method called process_friend_info and then supply the string as the parameter. Now the process_friend_info will use the JSON library to convert that JSON string into a list of friend info objects, and then that completes the background processing. And then when I come in, after the do in background is executed, then the Android framework is going to come in and call this method called the onPostExecute. This onPostExecute method is going to be executed on the main UI thread. So any code that you include here will be executed on the main UI thread. So here you can do whatever is needed to modify the user interface. So when I come into this method, I am now initializing the array adapter and then setting the adapter for my list view to be this array adapter. And then I am dismissing the progress dialog. So at this point, my list view has been rendered, and then I can dismiss the progress dialog so that the user can be returned to show the list of friends. There is another method that is available also called as onCancelled. So if your AsyncTask is doing some work in the background and you want to cancel that work, then the Android framework can call the onCancelled method and then essentially stop the background processing on your behalf. If you need to cancel the method, you will call the tasks cancel method, That'll be a call into the Android framework. At that point, the Android framework will come in and call the onCancel method. In here, you can do something to handle the fact that your background processing has been suddenly canceled by the user. In this case, if that happens, I just want to dismiss the dialog, progress dialog, and then move on from that point. So that completes the implementation of the contacts.java file. Now let's execute this application and see it running on the screen. So you will see that it is doing exactly what you expect it to do on that you saw at the beginning of the exercise. So when your app starts running, you see that the progress dialog is displayed, and then when it completes, then your list of friends is being displayed on the screen. Now, one thing missing from here is the fact that the friends' pictures have not been replaced by their images. Now, how do we do that part? This part is handled inside the array adapter. So that is where we have access to individual list items. So that is where we should be doing that work. So let's now go and examine how we're going to do that inside the myArrayAdapter.java file. Now, switching to the myArrayAdapter.java file, you notice that in here we are initializing each one of those list items. So this is where we initialize the two text views, the name of the friend and the status message. So obviously this is where we should be loading in the image of the friend into place in the image view. Now, if you need to download an image, either read in from the assets folder or download the image from a server, this is going to take some time. Now, if we end up doing this in this method, then it is going to literally freeze your user interface at this point. So we want this download of the image to be done in the background again. And then when the image is downloaded in the background, then I want the image view to be updated. Now, you can also employ an async task to do that at this point and offload that work to an async task. That's the natural instinct that you will have at this point. Fortunately for us, there is another library available for us called as the Picasso library, which does all this work for you in the background. All that you need to specify is the URL of the image from where you need to download and specify the image view that needs to be updated when that URL is downloaded. And the Picasso library takes all this work into the background and then does the processing asynchronously, and then your UI will be updated behind the scenes when the image has been downloaded. So to help us do that, I have a to-do comment here. I'm going to replace the to-do comment with the appropriate code that invokes the Picasso library and does the work in the background. Now, if you need to use the Picasso library, obviously, just like in the previous exercise where you imported the JSON library, you would have to import the Picasso library by specifying it in the build.gradle file. Now, this is a good time for you to visit the build.gradle file and see how I included the Picasso library in there. Now, I'm going to replace the code with the to-do statement and then come back and explain to you what is happening there. Coming back again to the myArrayAdapter.java file, I have replaced that to-do statement with the code to load the image in the background. Now, I get a reference to the image view at this point. This image view corresponds to that specific list item that I am currently updating. And then I call Picasso library, and this is the syntax for calling the Picasso library. Whenever you are using any one of these libraries, it's a good point to go and read the documentation of the library to understand exactly how it works. But to simply state, it's fairly straightforward to understand what this statement is doing. It is calling the Picasso library, and with the current context, it says load this file. This file is specified in the JSON string. I have specified the image URL in the JSON string, as you would notice. And I then load that image into this image view that I have, whose reference that I have just obtained. So when I call Picasso library and hand over all this information to it, then Picasso library's code will take over at that point and then do this work in the background. And then when the image has been downloaded, then the image view will be automatically updated asynchronously at that point. So all this work is done again for me. From my perspective, it is just one single line of code where I specify the piece of information, and then I have a whole library that is doing my work in the background and doing the update. So once we have completed this update, let's now see the app running on the emulator. Again, now when the app starts running, you would notice that your list view has been loaded and the images of your friends are now replaced with real images. Now these images I have included in the assets folder of your application. In the next exercise, we are actually going to go and fetch this information from a server in the background and then come back and construct the user interface. So we're going to go to the next step. We're going to examine how the networking support in Android can be leveraged for accessing a server and then downloading the JSON string from the server. And then subsequently in the assignment, you're going to then go ahead and then load these images from the server in the background.